The topic I'm giving now, I just want to give a little bit of background before we begin. I've been involved with an organisation called Conservation Breeding Specialist Group, CBSG, and what they've been working on is material on how to assess disease and pathogens in wildlife. And the specific part I've been involved in for that is when you're wanting to reintroduce animals back out into the wild, what sort of process you need to go through. That is the overall sort of idea. What I'm going to show you today is a practical workbook based on that work. And you will have access to this from Javier because I've given all the material. And what I was hoping is that you'd have a hard copy each and work through as I go. Unfortunately, that is not the case. So today will just be a brief demonstration, and then you will get the material yourselves. Unfortunately, it's not in Spanish, it's English and French. First off, though, a little bit of background in risk management. And is everyone familiar with the term of PPE, personal protective equipment? As vets, everyone knows that term? As vets, we are constantly coming into contact with various hazards. And we have to be able to assess the risk of those hazards. A hazard could be a feral dog, somebody's pet. But in wildlife, we're much less sure of what those risks could be. And PPE, personal protective equipment, helps us to better manage those risks. And this is a real-life example of PPE in use. What you first must do is put personal protective equipment on. It's no good if you don't have it there. So you first put it on. You then need to have a friend with you to make sure that if you're putting yourself into danger with wildlife, that they will be able to assist you when you need it. So you need a buddy or a standby person as you go into a risky situation. You then need to be able to use light, because obviously we are visual creatures, and if you can't see the hazard, then you can't manage against it. You then need to be able to identify the hazard as you find it. And if you encounter that hazard, you need to be able to do something about it. What would you do in this situation? Well, at least if you have personal protective equipment, you can partially protect yourself. Foreknowledge is forewarned. And then you have your buddy to be able to take you out of that situation. And everybody is happy with a job well done if you're better prepared. So my talk today is all about being prepared in a tricky situation. And you're just sitting there wondering what the hell is going on up here. Do you? So okay, this was meant to be after a coffee break, all right? So I'm sorry. Okay, on with the serious stuff. I've just wasted 5 minutes of my precious time. Okay. That looks much more serious, doesn't it? Okay. Right, practical wildlife disease risk analysis. These are the covers of 2 documents, and I would love to be able to give you these documents. The trouble is they're not going to be published for another couple of months. So you should at least know about them, because what I'm going to talk about is based on these documents. First one is a new one called the Manual Procedures for Wildlife Disease Risk Analysis. That is basically, if you are working with wildlife, as a veterinarian, as a wildlife manager, as a government, what are the questions or the processes you have to go through to be able to know what sort of disease risks are in your population of wildlife you're looking for. So that is a practical book that brings together lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds on how to work through those processes. So it's a practical guide. The other one is is a smaller section on that, looking at the principles involved, and that's in the IUCN, the International Wildlife Conservation Union. Sorry, the International Union of Conservation in Nature. So going back to the original name. And that's their guidelines for wildlife disease risk analysis. With the information that you can get through Javier electronically, I've given it to Javier. I don't know who they are. Yeah, back in your box, thank you. All right. Sorry. So, I'm going to this talk in three parts. The first part is looking at basic principles, okay, which hopefully will just be a refresher course for you as veterinarians. I then have a chimpanzee example of what to do in a disease outbreak at Chester Zoo, so in a zoo situation. And then what I was hoping is that we would all have a go in how to work through what to do in a disease outbreak. Unfortunately, it's going to be me up here telling you stuff, but that's sort of the idea. Sorry, it doesn't come out terribly well, I'm afraid, but that diagram is the centre of everything that I'm talking about. And you must be able to communicate, risk communication, for all the different steps that you go through in disease risk analysis. So we'll be coming back to that diagram. But basic principles. You're all familiar with the chain of infection, in that you have a source of disease, or a source of pathogen, that is transmitted to the host. Often the source is the same as the host, but what we as veterinarians try to do is to break the transmission cycle. We can't get rid of the source, and we can't get rid of the host. That would be defeating the purpose. So what we try and do is to break the chain of infection by reducing or trying to stop disease transmission. Sources of infection. As veterinarians, we are involved in postmortems and we are able to get access, more than most people, to body parts. That sounds a little bit mad, actually, doesn't it? You know what I mean? And so, okay, so you are putting yourself in potential danger of getting a pathogen transmission. Feces and urine. Does anyone like to have a guess as to what species of poo that comes from? It's an orangutan. I don't know where to be able to tell. There we go. Direct contact and aerosol. Environmental contamination is also a problem, especially when you're dealing in developing countries, but also in Europe as well. And you need to be able to understand and look for potential pathogen transmission through poor water, so in water, and also through the environment and soil. You're familiar with the fecal-oral transmission cycle, and so disease and or pathogens can be transferred from fecal-orally, again by direct contact, aerosol, and also the skin acting as a barrier along with our immune system, and if there is any breakdown in that barrier, it makes it easier for pathogens to be transmitted. Anybody wants to look at this photograph and sort of will be able to name ways that disease, potential transmission routes from here? Obviously, we have direct contact. We have the possibility here of oral transmission of disease. And one must, one must always be aware, because I was at a workshop in Africa last year, that when we bring people who work with animals together, that is the potential for disease transmission as well. Very professional. Now, when you're working, these things are a fantastic way to transmit disease. Don't pick your nose. Don't stick things in your mouth. And we all know that these are ways of disease transmission, but when you're trying to put that message across to people who are not coming across it every day, like potentially managers you are working with or non-veterinary trained people, you need to be able to put it into a context that they understand. So I think these pictures are funny, but it sends a message that, you know, if you can make the link between these are quite dirty. So the English way of shaking hands is not a good way to greet each other. It's much better to kiss on both sides of the cheek because it's cleaner. And that's been scientifically proven. A quick word on vectors. Obviously, the pathogens they can be spread, for example, by things like midges and mosquitoes. And although in some parts of the world it's widely, acupuncture is widely practiced, I think this chap is taking what we say in extracting the urine that's taking the piss. Okay, so. You have, I was asked a question before about how I was saying about the parrots coming into a wildlife centre. How do you stop disease transmission from occurring from them to the apes or to whatever else? And I said I would touch on it in this talk about the issue of quarantine. And the reason quarantine is so important to be able to stop that transmission is mainly because of that area there. And that there are many pathogens that we deal with that if you have an animal that is infected and there's a certain length of time of an incubation period, that they are not infectious. And many diseases, influenza included, have an infectious period. They become infectious before you start to see signs of clinical disease. And this is a very common time to then infect another thing, and that's how you. And so one way that we can try and break this transmission cycle is a period of isolation or quarantine. So these sorts of very basic principles that as veterinarians we know all about, but when we're working in projects, we don't work all the time with only other veterinarians, and so therefore we need to be able to communicate these things and say, well, what do you say to your manager if the animal looks perfectly healthy, come and just put it with the others? And the way we manage that is looking at biosecurity and surveillance. So disease surveillance, these are some shots that I've taken at Chester, just to give you an example. So you can have direct access to an animal if you're obviously looking for various types of diseases. You can do it remotely. This is an orangutan. And it's an image taken with a thermometry camera. And what we were trying to see is if you could take the pupil or the ocular temperature, whether that was an indication of whether the animal was pyrexic or not. So you're taking temperatures over time without needing to get access to the animal. And when you're dealing with wildlife, being able to get remote information as much as possible is often the only way you're going to get any information at all. Is Lion still here?
Yeah.
Hello. Hello. I'm trying to put everybody into this talk that was here that I knew. But anyway, so as you've heard today from numerous talks that with the rehabilitation of young primates, it's social, it has to be, and you should be having a primary caregiver of a baby primate. So both of these chimpanzees, actually I'm not really sure about this one, but they have their family members were victims of bushmeat, just as you've heard from other stories this morning. And as such, they are dependent, at least in the initial parts of the rehabilitation process, on a single human caregiver, preferably a human caregiver that doesn't have any access with the other primates. And so for social reasons, this has to occur. But as veterinarians or veterinary advisors to these sorts of projects, we need to know for ourselves, this is obviously direct contact, is there a possibility of disease transmission? And what diseases are they going to be? I won't name the centres, and obviously you know all of the people here anyway, but in this particular situation, this person is obviously not African, but she was co-managing the centre, and she was a TV producer. She had no access to the other primates. So as an initial caregiver, with training, with husbandry training, she was actually quite a good person to have, because what we can test her for diseases, and we can test the babies for diseases. As youngsters, there's likely to be a problem. But you are not, it's never what I'm getting at, it's not going to be a black or white decision, in that this sort of socialization initially has to occur. And what we have to do is reduce the risk of disease transmission. 99 times out of 100, it is from the person to the animal. That's the main disease transmission that we try to break. So preventing human to animal disease spread. The other thing is, I was looking at photographs like this. If you're not trained in things like disease transmission, the first thought is, oh, that's a cute photograph. I wish I could do that. These sorts of images put onto Facebook or what have you are a bad thing politically, let alone disease transmission-wise, because what we have here, and sorry to pick your outline, because I know you're doing a great job here at Takagama, is a Western person holding a baby chimpanzee, and that sends a very negative message to African governments and African people. So it's a good way to raise money, but these sorts of images have to be used extremely carefully. Preventing human to animal disease spread in areas of ecotourism. And this is the tributary of the Kinabatangan River in Sabah in Malaysian Borneo. And so here you have proboscis monkeys and macaque monkeys, and you have, it's like a Disney ride. There are many, many people in boats coming here, and there are interactions between the wildlife and members of the public. How do you try and prevent disease transmission in that situation? You have people researching wild animals in the field, and I don't have time to go into it, but there's a paper, which I've also given to Javier, so you can access this as well, where they've proven that an outbreak of Streptococcus pneumoniae and respiratory syncytial virus in a wild group of chimpanzees in Côte d'Ivoire in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was brought to that area by the researchers looking at these chimpanzees. So the people go into the forest, they bring these diseases that are relatively mild in people, and they kill the chimpanzees, and that's been proven. So you have to be very careful and understanding of how disease transmission can occur. Now, of course, with new protocols, there's a reason why there is a distance between primate and human, for example, when you're researching them. Preventing animal to human disease spread as well. In a zoo situation and even in a rehabilitation centre, knowing how to handle an animal correctly. That makes the animal less stressed, and also so therefore the person less likely to get scratched or bitten. Now the other thing as well is, oh dear. If you can remember that image just for a moment, I might need IT assistance here too. Then the keeper there was not wearing any gloves either, so they've got direct contact. The animal was secure and happy. And the other thing that was on that slide was pest control. So we're talking about vectors. And, battery ran flat. Oh dear. Yeah, it's amazing. You're running on battery? Oh, learning dangerously. Okay. Let's have a quick. Okay, so none of that sort of information on disease or pathogen spread should be new. That was just like a brief recap. The next bit is I'm actually going to give you an example of a disease outbreak that we had at Chester Zoo in a group of chimpanzees. And as the veterinarians, I'm not going to concentrate on the disease itself. What I'm going to do is concentrate on how we change the management processes at the zoo to prevent that disease happening in the future, and how we communicated that, how we communicated that. There it is. Sorry. And that means basically practical biosecurity. So you also know, wash your hands. There are actually specific ways of how to wash your hands. As veterinarians, when we scrub up the surgery, it's second nature. We know this. but we are dealing with other people who are working with wildlife who don't understand this, and we need to be able to be there to be able to impart that sort of knowledge. Good environmental hygiene, basically, since we know that the way that pathogens are spread, then, for example, direct contact, changing your footwear, making sure enclosures and what have you are designed correctly to minimize the risk of disease spread. So, when it comes to the chimpanzee example, this is an outbreak that we suffered at Chester in 2009. We have, or had, a group of 30 chimpanzees in a single group. And in November 2009, we diagnosed a combination pathogen of respiratory syncytial virus and Streptococcus pneumoniae. The same combination that killed those chimpanzees in Côte d'Ivoire several years earlier. I don't have time to go into the RSV, strep pneumoniae, what they actually are, how they work together, what disease they produce, because I thought with this audience, you can look that up in a book. What I am going to do is go through how we managed it and how we communicated that information so we didn't face the same situation in the future. This is the chimpanzee enclosure at Chester Zoo. We have an indoor off-show area where the dens are, an indoor on-show area where members of the public can see, and an outdoor area surrounded by a moat. If you're ever designing a chimpanzee or any sort of ape enclosure in the future, no moats. Apes and water, unless they've, in certain specific examples, certainly zoo apes and moats do not go together. This enclosure is quite old. They drown. So the closest access that members of the public have to the chimpanzees, there's some chimpanzees there, I'm shooting this from the public area, is approximately 10 meters. Okay? So if a member of the public sneezed, and it was a still day, that vapor from that sneeze, it spreads about 2 to 3 meters, and it stays there for up to a couple of hours. So if you have another person coming through and walks through that sneeze, they have the potential of getting whatever that person had. But in our situation, that seemed a less likely method of spread for the pathogen. In the indoor area, there's no direct person contact at all, it's all behind glass. So this is the indoor yard area, and that area in blue is keeper access to the dens, which are numbered there. And that's the looking from the indoor area, and then the animals go into the indoor area and they go wherever they like. There's no assigned den to particular animals. And so the most likely cause of the point of contact between human and ape is with staff in this area. The other thing I should point out, and I should have said at the start, is both of these pathogens are of human origin. So that's important. We have an area at the end here where it's a crush cage, a squeeze cage, where we can anesthetize the animals without having to dart them. So, we have 30 chimps, all 30 chimps are affected. Now, that's a whole different logistical issue of how you try and treat 30 chimpanzees at the same time in the same group with no possibility of separating them. Unfortunately, 3 of them died. The clinical course lasted for 17 days. We were able to diagnose the cause within 48 hours, so getting quick access to virologists was very useful. And that actually changed the way we treated the rest of the 27. Now comes the bit that I wanted to sort of, so that's sort of like the background. We had a bad human source, not sure where the human source actually was, but a human source pathogen outbreak in a group of chimpanzees. We know it was human source because there was a human variant of respiratory syncytial virus, and it peaks in the human population in November. This outbreak happened in November. We had known Streptococcus pneumoniae carriers in the chimpanzee group, so they worked together. And there is a strong synergy between RSV and strep pneumoniae. You have strep pneumoniae first, that's the same sort of bug that causes pneumococcal meningitis, but 40% of people carry it around, no problem. If you get RSV at the same time, then the clinical disease of those two together is much worse than either of them individually. And so they were hit with a double whammy of disease. The lessons we learned: early anteborn diagnosis was very useful. As I mentioned, when 30 chimpanzees are sick, they are very difficult to medicate all at once. And the zoonotic disease risk management must include staff health. So you can't do this sort of thing with primates and not talk about staff health surveillance or staff disease surveillance. And planning risk communication isn't as easy as telling keepers to wear gloves and wash the food. It's much more involved than that. So, what do we need to do? We need to improve our biosecurity, update our human health protocols. We looked at prophylaxis, whether it was worthwhile to vaccinate the chimpanzees against strep pneumoniae strains. And also looked at the practices of what the zoo was doing on the husbandry side. Here we have Claire. She's a keeper. These boots, and she's wearing gloves. And in this area, that's a total change from going from another area of the zoo into this area. Here we have Neil in the outside area. You can't see his boots, but he hasn't changed the boots, and he's not wearing any gloves. So although we have gloves, masks, boots, overalls there ready to use, it comes back to making sure that they are actually used. So as part of this whole process, we constantly look what diseases are we looking at in our disease surveillance, in our staff and in our animals. Before this outbreak, we didn't look for respiratory syncytial virus. Now we do. So if somebody says, what diseases or what pathogens should I be looking for in my group of animals, it depends. That's where the risk analysis comes in. You cannot have a recipe list of diseases for every situation. You need to do a little bit more background work. And you need to be aware of what is, not only what the, if the animal is susceptible to infection, but what the likelihood is of that infection. So we produce disease fact sheets for us as the vets. And there's one, don't bother reading it, but you'll get a copy of it if you want to electronically. And basically it's an aid memoir. So if the current vets are run over by a bus tomorrow, then there is at least information on, this is the one for respiratory syncytial virus, what's at risk with the animals and with the humans, what has been seen at the zoo, where the likely sources are from, how it's transmitted, clinical signs, implications, treatment, management recommendations, and references, where that information came from. So that is an aid memoir for us to be able to refer back to, so we don't have to flip through all the information. So that's a part of the communication process that's very useful. Hygienic measures, making sure that not only are things written down, but that staff are complying with what they should be doing. I'm not saying that Neil here, bless him, was the one who spread the disease around, but he's potentially putting himself at risk because RSV is spread in the feces. And in adult humans, not a big thing, but it's the highest cause of infant mortality from pneumonia causes in the UK. So if you had a baby, then you could potentially putting that baby at risk. And that comes down to staff communication, both talking about things, but also producing fact sheets for them in a language that they can understand. I don't mean Spanish or English, but basically you're not talking down to people, you're talking with them, and because you'll find that if you're giving a technical talk to somebody who doesn't really understand the processes, they're not going to ask you, excuse me, I don't understand that, because that's embarrassing. So you need, and so that's why we work with the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine as a human organisation, or human disease-based organisation, that knows how to relate to people. It's their job. So we commission people who do this for a living, and that helps with communication, knowing the right people to be able to do the communication. And that then we, as our health advisors, say, okay, respiratory syncytial virus. If we have an outbreak, 95% of human cases happen between October and December. We did an outbreak of respiratory disease in February. Should we be considering RSV? Probably not. But since then, our investigations in the animals have picked up a number of viruses. Rhinovirus, for example, is very common, source of a common cold. And by communicating in that line, then that all informs what we then survey for zoonotic disease into the future. So rather than going through the process of how you do a disease risk analysis, I've gone straight to management and communication. This is a practical example of how to do it. That's a form. And that form is the information that we relay back to the keepers. That goes on their wall. And so therefore it becomes a disciplinary situation if they don't follow that procedure. So just to give you a little bit of a look there, so you've got what the organisation is, what the activity is, where it is, who is at risk. So here we have primate keepers and veterinary staff, sometimes people from maintenance, horticulture, various public members, other keepers have access to it. Numbers at any one time, supervised up to 6 per day, that sort of thing. What is the likelihood of disease transmission from our transmission routes? And then I've dropped off the arrow. This is all written by the manager. This is not written by the vet. Okay? And then you've got the vet bit down below on all the actual disease bits. And I'll come on to that in just a moment. How long have I got? How much longer? I need about 20 minutes. That's fantastic. Now the next bit is what I was hoping to do is, so that's it. Then you have got some basic principles and then an example of managing and communicating a disease problem within a zoo. This next bit, I was hoping to break out into groups and get you to do this for yourselves. But unfortunately what I'll have to do now is go through it on a PDF. Right. So, remember I mentioned the CBSG, and they have all this protocol book on how to deal with disease transmission in wildlife. Ooh, this is a practical application of those protocols. And I put it, the group of us put it together for primate centres in Indonesia. But it says, that's why there's an orangutan there, but it could be just as easy as anything else. Rule 1, don't panic. Okay, so what you do before, teamwork, during, that's what we do primarily as the vets, taking samples, doing postmortems, and how you assess it after. So I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I just want to pick out a few sentences, okay? These guidance notes cover both risks to human health and risks to other animals. They are designed so managers and vets can work together and best prepare to help to prevent disease outbreaks. One of the biggest problems we have, or that we've had experience with, is if you're dealing with a group of chimpanzees in the wild, or a group of chimpanzees in a rehabilitation centre or a sanctuary, and they start dying, and people start running around like headless chickens. That's a euphemism, sorry. Not being prepared. So the bulk of this document is to get people prepared before the disease outbreak happens. And how we've done that is, as a written document, there are hyperlinks throughout the document to other bits and pieces that will help you get prepared. Okay? So, a risk assessment. One of the first things as part of a risk assessment to do is figure out what your hazards are. And one way of doing that is create what's called a rough assessment. So, I'm sorry, I'll zoom in. Maybe a little bit higher. Can anybody read that? A little bit. This is the rest of what I was hoping you'd each have in this picture. But basically, okay, I'll go for the very top one, okay? Pathogen or disease, respiratory syncytial virus, okay, it's a virus. Likelihood, this is for chimpanzees, okay? Likelihood they're susceptible, out of 5, they're very susceptible, animals die with it. Likelihood of exposure, likelihood of becoming infected, likelihood of transmitting it to others, severity for the individual if they become clinical, severity for the population, zoonotic potential. And these are basically ranked, so you'd be able to see what is the most important disease that you should be looking for. And this is why it's important not to have a recipe list. Because if you have a recipe list, you could miss things. This is based on what you are seeing in the project that you're working with, and also the susceptibility. So you need a population of animals that are both susceptible to a disease, but also the likelihood of them getting it. And the second page for this disease, known primate species affected, it's just the apes. The human source, it's been seen at Chester, yes, so therefore there's a likelihood of them getting it again. And it's been seen in chimpanzees. The ID50, rather than saying it's 10%, 15%, high, medium, low, this is a rough assessment. It's basically giving you a management tool to figure out what's important and what isn't. It's transmitted by aerosol as well as species. And if there are specific biosecurity measures in place, what the virulence is, what samples we need, if we have a laboratory that will run those samples for us, and we're lucky enough to have a laboratory that will run the samples for free. So you're doing a cost-benefit analysis there. That's something that's like back at the napkin sort of stuff, is being able to figure out, as the first part of your risk assessment, for each taxonomic group, identify the main diseases of concern. And that hyperlink leads you to an example of how to do that. For the key disease risks, fill in the disease template, and there's that respiratory syncytial virus one as an example which I showed you before. Then we're looking at management, various components of hygiene, disease screening for the animals, for the staff. Who does that? An example of staff screening. Again, you should be having this, you can have this in front of you later on. But this has got here, for example, Giardia. And for Chester, we figured out we don't need to do screening. We only do screening in the face of an outbreak. So if we have a suspected Giardia case in our primates, that will trigger us to look for it in the keepers, as an example. So therefore, if you have particular symptoms, as a person who's looking after the animals, you should then declare that, and then you have criteria, as an example, of exclusion from those particular animals for a period of time. So for example, if you have, as a staff member, diarrhea for more than 24 hours, we would recommend that that staff member is excluded from direct access with apes until the diarrhea is stopped for 48 hours and consider a fecal sample. Now, this is not just out of the air. This is in consultation with our health advisors, which in this case was the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. Is this making sense? It's a process. You have all of this in place before you have a disease outbreak. And then you start to think whether you need prophylaxis for animals and for your staff. And then you have like I showed you in the thing before, in the PowerPoint, what you do as you go through. If you suspect zoonotic disease in the animal, then you refer to the disease fact sheet, check hygienic measures, staff in contact, talk to them about it, contact the health advisors, and it's that communication flow. Now seems very basic stuff, but you'll be surprised, it very rarely happens. This is exactly the same stuff, just done in the graph. There's the rough assessment, and that's the same stuff done in words. I just want to spend half a minute here on what you would do in this situation. So this is, we've got different situations here that have been put to vets working in the field and how they would handle this, okay? You have an outbreak. You have a sudden death of a 9-year-old female orangutan that has recently arrived in your quarantine. The only signs were that she seemed a little slower for 48 hours prior to death. Your manager asks to delay the necropsy as she has seen something similar and thinks it may be a poisoning. Referring to your risk assessment, try to convince her why this might be a bad idea. As in, why is it a bad idea to delay the necropsy? And at this stage, I'd ask you to break down into groups, go away, discuss it, and then come back and ask how you actually work with your manager to make sure you get the samples you need. Bless you. Okay, so, and then you go through the same situation on the second page. 5 days later, 2 more orangutans in the main group become anorexic and weak. non-responsive to supportive therapy, both die within 24 hours. The manager is away, and you can't get a hold of them, okay? These animals are in necropsy, then the stuff, what diagnostic samples do you take, what do you do, blah, blah, blah. And by going through this in a controlled situation, this isn't made up, by the way, this situation actually happened. So by going through in a methodical manner, you can then say, oh yes, it would have been better if we had this written down or that written down. So that's in French as well there. So that was the basic principles, how you work through. The second bit is how you prepare for an outbreak. And one of the biggest things is who you're going to call. Who is going to be able to help you in your hour of need as you have animals around you dropping dead? You're the point person, you're the vet. Fix this now. What are you going to do? So by having a network, one of the first things you need to do in the project is figure out who you're going to contact. Okay, and so for this organisation, it stands for the Orangutan Veterinary Advisory Group. Sorry for the acronym, but that's what it means. Okay, you contact the veterinary coordinator, or you want to contact your local government. You found tuberculosis in an orangutan, your manager's not there. You need to let somebody know who is that person, and also who is responsible for contacting that person. There's a lot of assumptions that are made to say, okay, well, I thought you were going to contact that person. No, I thought you were going to do it. If it's all written down before it happens, then things will work. Now, those people you contact don't always know. They've never been to your centre, they've never been to your zoo, they don't understand what your situation is. So what you need to do in the analysis process is what's called mapping the pathway. And the example we've got here is of an orangutan centre in Borneo. I would say you go to this place near Orangutan in central Borneo, they've got 625 orangutans. What images go into your head when I say that? You've got no idea how big the place is, whether it's forested, what sort of situation it is. So mapping the pathway with photographs and words, and you can go through that entire situation. And when you are contacting people, send this along so they don't give you information that is not relevant to your situation. And this all comes down to communication, where the animals move through. And that is also a good thing to do for your own peace of mind, so everybody in your own organisation knows what you do and where things move. Because I'm running short of time, I'm going to zip through here right to the very end, and which is what you do during an outbreak. So as vets, make sure that the protocols are visible, useful, and if they're useful and visible, that they're being followed. Okay? So biological sampling, we've got links to how you access samples in the field, what you use. So if the person who has to make the decision is not on site, then you can at least follow that through. How are you doing a proxy? That's linked as well. And then there's a document here that again from Lincoln Park Zoo in the States, which all the sanctuaries have. And so I know you've heard about Chimpunga and Luero. They're all members of PASA sanctuaries, so they all have access to this information. It was given to the managers earlier this year. So here's a primate necropsy. If you're a new vet at a chimpanzee centre, and unfortunately one of them dies, and you've never done a chimpanzee necropsy before, you at least have access to something that will help you and guide you through how to do the necropsy and what to look for. And there's actually, so you've got an external examination, and then you can look around, check the teeth, you've got photographs there, there's animation, so it helps that you have this information, okay? Obviously. Initial procedure, cut the joints, how do you do that? Cut through there, next, okay? Okay, sorry. Basic stuff, but it goes in a point-by-point way. And I'm sorry, yes, it's in English, but because of the pictures, then if you have this information before an animal dies, which the sanctuaries do, then you have a better chance, and then you have a for real, you have a better chance of getting the information that you need. I'm going to shut up now because everybody needs some lunch. But As I said, this information is very dry, just me standing here going through it with you. Javier has got it all, and it's open access. So if anybody would like it, then all you need is a memory stick. The end.